and welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Today I want to talk about a sobering topic. I want to talk about 3 reflections after visiting Auschwitz. Last week I had the opportunity to travel to Poland along with a group of pastors with Christians United for Israel. The point of the trip was to review the Holocaust sites, especially with the rise of antisemitism, with October 7th, things that I had hoped to never see, certainly in my lifetime, and not in the United States. In that context, just going back to Poland, to the sites of the Holocaust, of this industrialized murder and hatred, it was an incredibly sobering experience. In fact, a bit overwhelming at times. It just left me in tears, just almost as if someone just punches you in the gut. It is such evil possible in this world, and so much to reflect on as the world has wrestled with these events since they occurred. And so I wanted to bring 3 quick reflections from my time there in Poland. I'm sure there will be other things as we move forward from this particular trip, but I wanted to bring a couple of reflections. I'm just going to dive right in. Now, this particular program is probably not appropriate for younger listeners, certainly if they're under the age of 10. Now, I do believe that we need to expose our children to the truth rather than allowing the world to do that or secular forces to do that. But I do actually just want to go into some very heavy things. I want to try to pass along to you some of what I experienced while visiting Auschwitz and other death camps, other sites of the Holocaust. And so I'm not going to mince words. I'm going to share some really tough things today. So I did want to at least note that for parents for this particular episode. Let's dive right in. The first thing I want to mention is simply the inhumanity that I experienced as I visited Auschwitz and other death camps. If you've studied the history of the Jews, I imagine many of our listeners are familiar with this, but going way back, all right, so moving back into ancient history a bit, shortly after Jesus died, rose again, and ascended up into heaven, AD 70, the Jews come in a series of wars with the Jews, eventually destroy the temple, eventually kick the Jews out of their homeland, Judea, the sites of the Bible, and they are kicked out really into the 4 winds. They travel into Europe, they travel into Africa, into Asia, and so there are Jews living in Poland. By the time, I'm kind of fast forwarding here a lot of history, by the time of the Middle Ages, the Jews are there in Europe, but they're not really wanted anywhere. They're kicked out of England. There's certainly the Inquisition in Spain, and it just seems wherever they go, they're persecuted, they're not wanted, they're harmed. And so Poland became a unique place. Poland allowed them to settle there, to become part of their communities, to assimilate even into the Polish army. And there's something like 6 million Jews living in Europe at the time of the outbreak of World War II, and that's probably a third of the Jews alive around the world at the time. And if you're familiar with the pogroms, so the Holocaust actually had kind of a prefigurement or something that occurred previously about 20 years before. There in Russia, other places as well, maybe something like 100,000 Jews were actually killed there, where oftentimes their neighbors that lived close to them came in, ransacked their houses. There was murder, there was rape going on. And in Europe, I mean, this is supposed to be this enlightened society. We're talking about the early 1900s at this point. And so there's some really dark history. If you've never studied that, it prefigures the Holocaust. Of course, the ominous event that came right before the Holocaust happened is the rise of Hitler, the Nazi Party in Germany. Anti-laws begin to be passed. In Mein Kampf, of course, it considers the Jews to be less than human. And so the Aryan race, blood and soil there, the Aryan race is supposedly the highest race, and so they need living room. But in this 1,000-year Reich that Hitler is supposed to build, the Jews are not allowed. And this is a point of the rise of the Nazi Party. This fuels what happens there in Germany. And so there begin to be anti-Jewish laws. You can't own a business. You have to sew the yellow star onto your clothing. And so just a little bit of a review of history there. So you fast forward then as the Nazis come into power, and then as World War II breaks out, with Germany and then Russia agreeing to invade Poland together. And so the the Germans come in, they attack. Polish army really has no chance, and wherever they come into power, they began to put the Jews into ghettos. I'm sure you've heard of these ghettos before. The most famous of them is probably the Warsaw Ghetto, but there were something like 1,200 of them. And so I mentioned the inhumanity. Through everything that I saw, the Germans attempted to strip the Jews of their humanity. So, for example, in the Polish ghetto, they went from something like 1,800 streets. So the Jewish quarter there in Warsaw was massive. They were in all parts of Polish life. They inhabited something like 1,800 streets. They walled them in, and there is actually still the one final section of the wall of the ghetto. It's massive. It was made of brick. It was very difficult to tunnel under. There'd be barbed wire on the top, and so you're not getting out. So 1,800 streets down to just 73. A very, very tight space. Where there once was 600 synagogues. So there were 600 synagogues in Warsaw prior to the war. I had a chance to go visit the last remaining one. They destroyed all the rest. This particular one was just a big building, and they used it as a stable. So desecrating the sacred spaces. That's another point of inhumanity. As workers would cross from one side of the ghetto to the next, the Germans would just shoot them randomly. Why? Because they were Jews, and they could. And so they would shoot them as they would cross, and so you never knew if you were going to work, coming back, if you'd make it home. And also, just imagine this. If you were not working in the ghetto, you received 150 calories a day. 150. That's less than a lot of granola bars. And if you were working, you had 750 calories a day. And it was something like 40 people to a one-bedroom apartment, just stuffed into these spaces. And so throughout the ghettos, people just died by the droves. If you were ill, there no medicine, you don't have any food. Disease would just spread rampant. So probably 80,000 to 100,000 died there in the Warsaw Ghetto. And so in ghettos throughout German-occupied territory, the Jews were just rounded up, placed in these ghettos, treated as if they were less than human. Now moving forward into the final solution, which essentially went along with Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. My understanding is that there was a discussion in the Nazi high command. Do we use the Jews? And again, I'm just sharing this terrible perspective from their point of view here. Their conversation was essentially, do we use the Jews for labor or do we kill them? And the party and Hitler himself said, no, the final solution is death. And you know the story, but it's just horrendous. That something like 6 million Jews are just marked for death because they're Jews. This was the motivation. And again, I imagine most of us know these facts, but to literally be there in person and to see this, Auschwitz, which I visited, was chosen because of its central location along railroad tracks. And so from Italy, from Greece, from France, from Poland, of course, but then even into the Soviet Union, Jews could be shipped in cattle cars. So a cattle car used for something like 6 to 7 cows, the Germans would stuff something like 50 to 100 people, and then they would lock the door. They would seal the door. Now, there were no bathroom facilities. There's no windows. There's just a little bit of ventilation in one window that had kind of been boarded over. Why? So that nobody could see this. And sometimes the victims would be on or in these cars for 12 days. 12 days. And so by the time they arrived in Germany or in Poland at these death camps, sometimes half of the people would already be dead. There's a story of one young girl who's 13, I'll tell a little bit later, how her mother would try to kind of pull her up to one ventilation port and just kind of hold her up there so she could get some air. And so again, just shoving them into a cattle car, no bathrooms, little ventilation. And then once they arrived at the camp, and what I'm going to do is kind of move from those that were allowed to live and to work, and maybe for some that was a much worse punishment than even a quick death. But when they arrived, and I'll use specifically Auschwitz. Now, Auschwitz itself was more of a POW camp, a prisoner of war camp, used first for the Poles and Russians. Many medical experiments were carried out there. There initially was one gas chamber there, but it wasn't big enough. And so the Germans, and I'm just using this kind of industrial analogy, and doesn't that prove how they treated the Jews as inhuman? This is like industrialized animal slaughter. This is how they thought of it. This is how it's organized, as if it's a bunch of cows or pigs, and it just breaks your heart as you study these things and see them. So there was Auschwitz, which was more the POW camp, a number of brick buildings, formerly a Polish army base. But that wasn't big enough for their industrialized death and hatred. So they built essentially what's called Auschwitz II, or Birkenau, which is a much larger place. It's, if you see the railroad tracks going through an overpass there, it goes into the concentration camp. That is Birkenau. And there were barracks that could house hundreds of thousands of people, or 100,000 people or more, and eventually the Germans had plans to expand this place. But as they came in, they had all of their belongings, everything that the Germans allowed them to bring. They left them on the platform in between train tracks, and the Germans would be standing there, a German doctor, and he would look at the individual. If he thought the individual could work, they would go to one line. These individuals were often shaved, given a particular uniform. The men a beret, the women essentially just kind of a frock. They would shave off their hair, dehumanize them. They would then put them in a quarantine camp for a period of time. And just going there, you see the first barrack is the bathroom. And there's no privacy. And you think of what's kind of the most private room in your house, so you can go to the bathroom by yourself. And it is just no privacy. The holes in the latrine are just right next to one another, and just row after row of this. And individuals in the morning would have something like 5 minutes to go in there to take care of their needs, and then they would come out. And so everywhere, it just shows you how inhumane. The bunks, or the bunk beds that were assembled, there would sometimes be kind of 9 on the top, 9 in the middle, 9 on the bottom. And again, I'm not trying to be gross here, but if you essentially slept on the top during the winter, you might freeze to death. If you were on the bottom, the guards would probably beat you or worse. And then if you were in the middle, everyone, and I'm not trying to be gross, but just to transfer a little bit of the situation these people were in, everyone has dysentery. They're sick. And so there's no opportunity in the middle of the night to go out to the restroom. And so people are sitting there, and again, they're just all covered in filth and grime. All of this to simply dehumanize those that were there in the camps. We also know, especially there in Auschwitz and then in Birkenau, that there were just so many medical experiments. Things like just putting men in barrels of cold water and just seeing how long they could live. And cyanide injections, operations without anesthesia. There's a terrible story of young women that would have their ovaries removed just out of medical experiments, so they could never have children, even if they survived. And there was one story of a Jewish doctor that was actually forced to participate in these surgeries alongside a German doctor. So a Jewish doctor and a German doctor, and while the German doctor stepped out, the Jewish doctor just whispered to this woman, like, "You will thank me later." So she thought that she would never be able to have children, and later on was able to move to Israel, and she was blessed that she actually was able to have children because that doctor only removed one of her ovaries. So she could have children. Again, just these horrific things. And then I'll tell you, I don't know if you've ever just been in the presence of pure evil, or just experienced something that was just so gut-wrenchingly wrong against the created order. As I visited Auschwitz and Birkenau, there's just such a deep evil. It's hard to even communicate, having been there and just looking through these museums and seeing the cattle car. And if you follow me on Facebook, I've posted some of the pictures of this. But I mentioned the German doctor would push some people one way, other people another direction. So if you're able to work, they would put you into the work camp. You often didn't have long to live there. But then others were shuttled off straight to the gas chambers. And oftentimes you have to understand, again, using the industrial analogy, within an hour, many of the people that came to Birkenau were dead. By the end of the life of the camp, they had extended the railroad tracks to within just a number of yards from the gas chambers. And I always thought things were more spread out, but it's actually pretty close together. And they had things screened off so people couldn't see. And so right there on the train platform, men were separated from women. And then they would never see each other again because the women, those that were not well enough to work, were shuffled off and then sent straight to the gas chambers. And the way they had it set up is it looks like they were going down into kind of a bathhouse. And so then they're brought into this enclosure. And again, I'm just sharing the facts. And many of you know this. But then they were told to undress, to take off their belongings in front of the German captors. And then they were shoved into a room. The doors were closed. These Zyklon B was the gas. It was a pesticide. And they had experimented on other prisoners with this and found it was deadly. And they would drop that in. And then mothers and their children and their family would all suffocate, would die due to the gas. Between late April and early July of 1944, and again, it is hard to get your mind around the death of 6 million people, but between April and July 1944, approximately 440,000 Jews were deported from Hungary, and approximately 320,000 of them were sent directly to the gas chambers in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Get this, and so I mentioned kind of that period of time, but at its height, at Birkenau, 437,000 people died in just 56 days. All right, that's a sink in. 437,000 people in just 56 days. That is mechanized hatred and death at a scale it is hard to comprehend. And so there is just a pall over that place. It is still reeks of evil. Just the inhumanity. That was one of the things, again, that just jumped out. I'm trying to transfer just a little bit of what I experienced here. Another was the graves of approximately 800 children in the kind of forest. When you go into this space, it was a little bit darker when we finally made it there. You go down into just kind of the edge of a village. You go down into these woods, and they have marked off what is a grave of 800 children. They're from an orphanage. The Nazis drove them in trucks. They dug a grave. It's like a dump truck with a hydraulic lift. They just lifted that up, and all the children screaming, falling into this pit. Again, just because they're Jews. And of course, the children are screaming. And then an eyewitness was a young Polish boy. Was the only eyewitness of what occurred. He's watching, and as he's watching, they pulled pins, they threw in grenades, they used machine guns, and then they covered it over. And he said he could still see the earth moving for a time until all went still. And so again, just the children, the children. And so Hitler's command was to take care of the children, meaning kill them first because they represented the future of the Jewish people. And approximately 1.5 of the victims of the Holocaust were children. I know this is heavy, and I will pivot here in a minute, but given the rise of anti-Semitism, the things that we've heard over the last couple of months, like really, you deny that this occurred? I mean, go see it for yourself. And when our Jewish guide, an Israeli guide, one of his relatives is a Holocaust survivor, when we kind of brought this up, like, how can people deny this? He got a pained look on his face. Like, how can you deny it? And essentially he was like, well, look around. Come see this for yourself. It absolutely occurred. Come see the grave of 800 children in the woods. And so just the fact that there are people denying this, that there's a rise in anti-Semitism, what happened in October 7th, it just brings all of this into focus. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, when it was liberated by the Soviets, over 900,000 shoes were found. The shoes are always something that get me, and I'm sure you've seen pictures of that, but something that really hit me hard this time is that there was something like 7 tons of human hair processed out of Auschwitz-Birkenau, because you have to understand when, of course, when they're going, part of the process, they're going into before the gas chamber, they're cutting off all of the human hair. And then after the individuals are dead, there were doctors, or there was parts of the Sonderkommando, the work group, that were required to pull out any gold teeth, anything of value they would take from the body. And so when the Soviets arrived, there was something like 2 tons of hair left, representing about 40,000 women. And something about hair, it is one part of the human body that does not decay as fast. In fact, it can last for a long period of time. And so there is a display in Auschwitz of the hair. Something, it's not all of that. It's not all 2 tons, but it is a massive amount of human hair. There was some of it that was still braided, as if the day that this was taken from a woman victim. The prayer shawls were made into dresses for younger. Something that is so sacred was made into dresses for young girls in Germany. And one last thing that just really kind of punched me in the face, it just gut punch, was in Majdanek, which is another death camp. And the deadliest day in the Holocaust occurred there. They called it the quote-unquote Harvest Festival, where they played music while they just machine-gunned the Jews, the Israelis that were there, and something like 43,000 died in the course of 2 days. But they're in the crematorium, because, of course, they take these bodies. They wanted to do away with the evidence. This was the best-kept secret in the Reich, right? They, in the crematorium, just how sadistic is this? The Nazi commander, when they built it, had a private restroom installed. It's cold there in Poland in the winter, and he had a bathtub put in there, and the hot water was heated. This is just terrible. Was heated by the flames of the crematorium where the victims were being burned. So the bodies of the victims of the Holocaust fueled his hot bath. You don't get more inhuman than that. So, in a sense, there was the inhumanity. But then there was also humanity. And what I mean by this is that there were something like 2 million Jews murdered by soldiers in forests in the USSR when they invaded, called Battalion 101. And there's a book by Christopher Browning that just says, it's called Ordinary Men. And there's been so much written and studied over this. But how could you do this? How could just normal individual, who could go in and just murder men and women day after day after day? And Christopher Browning's argument is that many of these men were not just young converts to Nazism. They've been raised in that. Many of them, the average age was 37 and a half. Many of them had children and wives of their own, families of their own. And so how could you do this? So there is a humanity aspect of this. We're like, well, we would never do this, and this would never happen again. Like, no, if the right social factors are present, the indoctrination, but also the peer pressure. And it's said that at first some of them, these are largely Protestant. Germany's something like 75% Lutheran before the war. That at first said, hey, I don't want to do that. I want to go help make dinner. And I'm not going to participate in the killing. But as time went on, fewer and fewer individuals were conscientious objectors. And so you think about peer pressure, groupthink, that it is possible. Also, Hess, the commander of Auschwitz, his wife and 4 children, his house was something like 50 yards from the gas chamber at Auschwitz I. They had a pool. They raised rabbits and vegetables, and they had an additional baby. There's, the picture looks like a normal family. They had vacation visitors that wrote letters back to them saying how wonderful it was. And Hess would take it appears he would take, a guest, he would take them into Auschwitz, and they would say, well, you're doing such a good job at what Hitler wants. And so you see this absolute inhumanity and then humanity. Now I want to speed up a bit more. I don't have a ton of time. I'm actually here in Jerusalem today. We're headed out on a tour, but I wanted to get this to you. So one, I would say it is the inhumanity. But secondly, I would say it's the subterfuge. So the Jews were put in ghettos until they could figure out, in a sense, what to do with them. And if you remember, certainly Mein Kampf, treating them as if they were less than human. But how did the German state do this on such an industrial scale? Well, they had a propaganda machine to beat many propaganda machines. And in a sense, as you go into many concentration camps, one aspect of this is that the sign that sits over Auschwitz, the famous sign, it reads, "Work makes you free." And so they were always treated as if they were work camps or relocation camps. And so the Jews were told they had to relocate. And so they told them they had to pack a suitcase. And in Auschwitz, there's a major display with the suitcases, with their name, with their birth date, numbers, and they told them, hey, you can only bring so much, but bring what you need. Bring your pots and pans, bring your clothing, put them into a suitcase, and then they made them pay for their ticket to Auschwitz. Let that sink in for a moment. They made the Jews pay for a ticket to their death. And so they said, bring enough clothes for your kids, bring your pots and pans. They then put them in cattle cars so that no one in and around could see what was happening. Now, over time, people understood things happened and they could see it, but it allowed people to just look the other way. It's troubling that out of the millions of people in Europe at the time, that there's only something like 28,000 righteous among the nations. This is the terminology the Jews used for individuals that helped the Jews during the Holocaust. So the Germans tried to hide it from the public, and many others, I'm sure, just looked the other way. When they arrived into Birkenau, and this is just one example of many other death camps, things would be similar. They had this down to, again, an industrial scale murder at the end of the war. They would tell them, hey, leave everything on the platform. It'll be collected. It will be sent to you. And then they're told, hey, we're going to separate you over here. And then the women and children are told, hey, you need to go over into this kind of grove of trees. And then we will process you, and then we will get you into the camp. And so the whole time, you can imagine a mom with children. And there's a particular photo that I've shared online that absolutely haunts me. And there are these little children, they look confused. I mean, you've been on a cattle car, there was no bathroom in there, it was hot, or maybe it was freezing cold, and you've arrived at this new place. You don't even know where you are. You don't know how many days you've been on there, perhaps. And you get out, and you're confused. The moms are, just trying to protect their kids. The dads are, and they're all separated. This is the last place they saw each other. And and then they are taken out, to the grove, and then they're told, hey, come in here, we're going to process you. Told to, remove your clothes, you got to get a shower. We wanted to remove any insects or pests from you, shave your hair for that reason too. And then not until the door closed, the bar comes down, and then the guard on top of the gas chamber would open it up with a gas mask, drop the Zyklon B gas down in there. And it wasn't until that many people realized what was going on. And so, and even the terminology, so that they would use prisoners to drag the bodies out, the Sonderkommandos. Sonderkommando was a work group for this purpose. And how horrible is that? That you'd have to do this day after day, and then many of them were killed to make sure that no one talked. But even the language, they would look through the peephole, they would look through the hole, and the language was, well, everyone is asleep. Everyone is asleep, and then they would begin to pull them out. There are fabric screens around the crematoriums because at Auschwitz-Birkenau, other prisoners could see the area where the gas chambers were, so they had fabric screens up. And so everything that was done with deep subterfuge, with coded language, because they didn't want people to know. And it's certainly, I've always been cautious. And again, government has a proper role, and I think those serving in government can do good things. But it did certainly make me cautious when governing authorities say something. It's always a trust but verify situation, maybe verify then trust. And so this certainly, you see what happened on an industrial scale. It was this massive subterfuge. So you might be thinking, wow, this is heavy. I thought I just wanted to run, or I thought I was just going to drive to work, and now I don't know if I can go on today. I'm going to need to take a day and just sit and pray over this. So I did want to end with the resilience throughout this, just horrific conditions. I mean, the most extreme conditions that human beings could live in, and you see the resilience of the human spirit. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising, something like 700 to 1,000 Jewish fighters realized that they were going to be killed, and so they fought the Germans, having smuggled in weapons many times through the sewers. There was a Jewish cemetery just outside of the Warsaw Ghetto, and I've shared pictures of that online as well. Almost impossible to climb up these things, but they used them. Another story: Helena Berenbaum, a 13-year-old girl, first sent to Majdanek, and then to Auschwitz. So she goes to Majdanek, this terrible death camp, worst day of the Holocaust. 43,000 Jews are killed. Was at Majdanek, and then she's sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and somehow she survives. Her mother, father, and brothers were all killed. And she was separated from her mother. I talked about how the families were separated. The Germans must have thought she looked like she was healthy enough to work, so they separated her into one group, her mother into another, and she never saw her mother again. She somehow survives. Even the death march from Auschwitz, as the Soviets got closer to the camp, the Germans marched many of the prisoners back into Germany. This was deadly to people that weren't eating much, that were sick. And she somehow survives all of that. Moves to Israel, gets married, has a family, has a beautiful life. Eventually, when she was older, she returns to Majdanek, and she tells the story of almost kind of seeing a vision of her mother and finally found closure. And so she was there to witness of the evil that had happened in that place. And standing there as the guide was telling the story, you can see what happened there at Majdanek was there were many of these prisoners' bodies that were burned, and so the actual memorial at Majdanek has something like 7 tons of human ashes in it, and it just has a warning, like, let our story be a warning. And she was able to kind of stand in front of that and tell her story. She survived. There's another beautiful story about a 14-year-old named Peter Gentz, who was a Holocaust victim. And he drew a picture that shows the surface of the moon looking back towards the Earth. And it's remarkably accurate. It was actually sent up into space with an Israeli astronaut, and then there's been another copy sent up into space. And so you think about the triumph of that. Also, our guide, his name was Elijah, we called him Eli, an incredible experience, an incredible guide. His own relatives, or one of them was a Holocaust survivor. And he talked about, well, what is the response to this? What is, in a sense, like the Jewish revenge for the Holocaust? And he talked about, well, it is the fact that I'm here today. It is the fact that the nation of Israel exists despite Hitler's efforts. And just the resilience of the Jewish people throughout all of this. It was incredible to witness the stories of humanity. There's Viktor Frankl's book about finding happiness and how do you survive psychologically in the middle of something like this. And so there were stories of the triumph of the human spirit, of hope in the midst of this incredible, incredible darkness. Yesterday, I mentioned I'm here in Israel. Yesterday, we actually went to the site of October 7th. And there were just so many similarities of people just being killed. We're just in this very calm village on the very south of Israel, right on the border of the Gaza Strip. They are farmers. They're farmers, and the air raid siren went off at 6:30. A woman stepped into a shelter there, and just one story: the terrorists came in, turned around, and just because she was a Jew, killed her. Something like 10 times. Just an older woman just executed her from just a few feet away. Going to the site of the Nova Festival, and I'll talk more about this, and seeing so many young victims, and it just smacked again of the same thing of just this hatred of the Jews, killing them because they are Jews. But there, just outside of that village, has been erected the largest, I think it's the largest Jewish flag or flagpole in Israel. And it was just waving in the breeze yesterday. And I thought, that is the answer to this, that the nation of Israel exists despite Hitler's efforts, despite everything that he and his cronies did in this death and hatred on an industrialized scale. The nation of Israel still exists. And as we're driving back yesterday, you can see cranes, construction cranes, filling the skyline of Jerusalem and of other cities as the Jewish people move forward. And so I wanted to end this podcast on, it's such a heavy thing, but on that note, that they have moved forward. It's an incredible story of resilience. As I bring the episode to a close, I wanted to point you to, if you've never read the opening statement of Justice Jackson, a U.S. jurist who was given the task of, in a sense, kind of overseeing the Nuremberg trials, and he made an opening statement. And it is a powerful, powerful statement of just moral clarity. Because as you think of humanity, I mean, if we had any hope that humanity in and of itself could be good, and we could be righteous, it certainly should die when you look at what happened in Poland. We as human beings are capable of intense, incredible evil. And so there is no hope in life and death without Jesus Christ. There is no truth. There is no hope for humanity. There is no hope for history without the truths of Scripture. Without the moral guidance that God has set out for us, history will continue to be filled with these dark pages. And certainly there is an aspect of this that I think is spiritual. It said that I think a German ruler had asked someone, what is proof of God? And the individuals looked back and said, the Jews. I mean, you think about Pharaoh, Haman, Herod, the pogroms, Hitler, now Hamas. Throughout history, God's chosen people have been killed, they've been persecuted, they've been murdered. And so you see this throughout it. And I'm sure I'll have more as I process what I have seen. But today I want to just close with some of the comments from Justice Jackson's opening statement at Nuremberg. So he says, what makes this inquest significant? And again, the Nuremberg trials, or the trials of the Nazi war criminals, is that these prisoners represent sinister influences that will lurk in the world long after their bodies have returned to dust. We will show them to be living symbols of racial hatred, of terrorism and violence, and of the arrogance and cruelty of power. They are symbols of fierce nationalisms and of militarism, of intrigue and war-making, which have embroiled Europe generation after generation, crushing its manhood, destroying its home, and impoverishing its life. Civilization can afford no compromise with the social forces which would have gained renewed strength if we deal ambiguously or indecisively with the men in whom those forces now precariously survive. And then this powerful statement, it really sums up what I experienced in Poland. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. I'll read that one more time. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. So those are a couple reflections after visiting Auschwitz. We'll be back with you next week.